Usury in Dante's Inferno, Ancient Origins, Modern Implications. Lending at interest is ubiquitous today. Mortgages, student loans, and credit cards have become an inescapable part of our daily lives. In fact, the financial system is now so intertwined with institutionalized money lending that few of us even question the ethical implications of this universal practice. Many people consider it to be something morally neutral, neither right nor wrong, which we must simply accept along with the rest of the contemporary economic order. Some even promote it as something good, which is a necessary means to achieving the end of a properly functioning modern economy. However, this indifference or praise for the practice stands in stark contrast to the position taken by medieval thinkers, who judged money lending to be something inherently evil. They condemned as the sin of usury both the subjective intention to receive more back on a loan than the lender first gave, and the objective act of receiving more than the principal in a loan, and only made exceptions in cases where the lender deserved a just recompense for having lost some wealth or opportunity for investment by extending a loan. Importantly, they did not reach this conclusion based on arbitrary sentiment, but through a combination of reasoned philosophical and theological argumentation. A dramatic example of this approach can be found in Italian poet Dante Alighieri's masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. Dante first touches on the sin of usury in Canto 11 of the Inferno, where Virgil briefly stops to describe the layout of lower hell before the pilgrims continue their journey down into the pit. The usurers reside in the third round of the seventh circle, where they are punished for violence against art. This phrase contains several important insights about the nature of usury worth considering in some detail. First, let us take the term art. Note that Dante does not mean art in the particular sense of drawing, painting, sculpture, etc., although these pursuits would fall under the category. Instead, he is applying the term art in a much more general sense to mean any endeavor by which man harnesses nature, that is, the world as it exists in itself apart from his influence, to work for his benefit. In this sense, art refers to the various practical disciplines, such as craftsmanship, industry, and technology, by which man takes the raw materials of nature and uses them to make artifacts that give him a livelihood. As Aristotle writes, the arts make their material. Some simply make it, others make it serviceable, and we use everything as if it was there for our sake. For example, in Dante's time, a cooper would take wood cut from trees, saw and carve it into staves, and then put these together to make buckets that might be employed to store grain or fruit, draw water from a well, or perhaps even hold milk from the village cow. Thus, we find there is a close connection between art and nature, for even complex artifacts like the electrical devices of our own times are still constructed from simple natural substances. A computer is composed of a complex array of parts and requires many stages of processing, refinement, and assembly to produce, but it too fundamentally consists of glass, metals, and other basic elements taken from the earth. And because no being in the world has the power to call forth these materials from the nothingness of non-existence, they must have been created by an omnipotent, transcendent God. Hence, Dante has Virgil say, all of nature, her laws, her fruits, her seasons, springs from the ultimate intellect. Therefore, in addition to the link between art and nature, there is also a bond between nature and God, which means that art is ultimately related to God. In other words, nature is the child of God, which means that art is his grandchild. Furthermore, human artifacts do not gain new properties of their own, but only display those already possessed by the elements of which they are composed. The cooper's buckets do not acquire the ability to move or reproduce themselves, but behave like the inanimate wood out of which they are made. Even the computer does not really think, but only carries out the processes it is programmed to do by the circuitry in its hard drive. Hence, Aristotle writes, "Insofar as they are products of art, they have no innate impulse to change. But insofar as they happen to be composed of stone or of earth, or of a mixture of the two, they do have such an impulse." Following this reasoning, and referencing Aristotle's observation that man has an instinct for imitation, Dante's Virgil agrees with the ancient Greek that art imitates nature. One might wonder what this apparent digression has to do with the topic of usury. The answer is found in the next few lines of the canto. Here Virgil points out that it is the nature of man to labor and prosper, citing the fall narrative at the beginning of Scripture, in which God tells Adam, "With labor and toil shalt thou eat thereof all the days of thy life." Accordingly, if man's art is to imitate his nature, man must make his livelihood from work, whether manual or intellectual, in which he produces something of value for himself or others. The usurer, however, does not perform any work himself, yet he makes a profit from the interest on his loans. What happens is that he unnaturally puts an object, his money, to work for him by making more money from the labor of others, rather than applying his own hands or mind to the task of earning his daily bread for himself. In this way, the usurer undermines and injures the order of creation. In other words, he does violence to nature. Consequently, Virgil says, "But usurers, by seeking their increase in other ways, scorn nature in herself and her followers." And because art is meant to imitate nature, the usurer also disfigures or does violence to art. Lastly, due to the fact that nature is the art of God, usury ultimately does violence to God. Recall from our previous discussion that the usurers inhabit the third round of the seventh circle in hell. Dante further describes the characteristics of this third round in Canto 14, which gives us additional insights into the attributes of the sins punished there. Specifically, the round manifests as a plain of burning sand, upon which falls great flakes of flame. These two features represent the main properties of usury as violence against art: sterility and wrath. The landscape is a barren desert where nothing can grow, representing the material cause of usury, the infertile medium of money. And the precipitation is an unnatural antithesis of rain, which torments the inhabitants instead of refreshing them, representing the efficient and formal causes of usury. It harms society by corrupting the natural order of enterprise. And the fire represents the final cause of usury, the anger of God falling upon the sinners from above, at the same time the ground beneath is burning them with the anger of nature. Dante offers more details about the condition of the usurers in Canto 17. As he writes, "Crouching close beside the brim, their eyes burst with their grief, their smoking hands jerked about their bodies, warding off now the flames and now the burning sands. From each neck there hung an enormous purse. On these their streaming eyes appeared to feast." Several insights are contained in this description. The sterility of their actions is illustrated by the sedentary posture and egocentric attitude of the usurers. They have no desire to move around or reach outside themselves through conversation, but remain fixated on their money bags. Lastly, their own wrath is illustrated by the reaction of the Paduan usurer to Dante's presence. "Leave us alone!" Despite the misery they experience in obsessing over their wealth, the usurers become angry when distracted from this fruitless task. One might wonder why Dante suggests that the sin of usury involves these qualities of sterility and wrath. The answer can be found in the philosophy of Aristotle and the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. According to Aristotle, the purpose or telos of enterprise is for man to acquire the necessities of life. For Aristotle, the natural way for man to subsist is by taking raw materials right from the land itself, as hunters do, or harvesting them after cultivating it, as farmers do. In these cases, there is a direct link between man's needs and the natural resources which satisfy them. From this, Aristotle concludes the natural world exists for the sake of man's use. However, because of natural inequalities in the distribution of goods, each individual cannot always get everything he needs for himself, but must sometimes go to others and trade with them the things he has for the things he lacks. Such barter involving the immediate exchange of one commodity for another is still entirely natural, since it remains oriented in every way towards the goal of enterprise, getting those things necessary for life. Nonetheless, as society develops and becomes more complex, goods themselves are not directly traded one for the other anymore, as in barter, but their value is instead transferred to a third party, money, which represents the real value of these other things in a symbolic form that is more convenient for large-scale commerce. Such transactions involving the immediate exchange of commodities, which are signified by the abstract concept of currency, are no longer wholly natural. For while they continue to be ordered to the ultimate end of acquiring necessities, they now require an artificial means to reach it. Money as money does not have any natural value of its own. Now, if money is made from gold or silver, it has natural value as a precious metal, but not insofar as it is money. Money only has the artificial value assigned to it by the community agreeing to acknowledge it as a medium of exchange that stands in for things having natural value, like grain, fruit, meat, etc. This means that money cut off from its natural referent becomes completely unnatural. Something supposed to be only a means becomes an end in itself. This is because natural things are intrinsically fertile in that they are either living organisms which reproduce themselves, or are commodities which sustain or improve the lives of other organisms, as food, clothing, and other artifacts do for man. But the artificial medium of money, though it can be used to obtain fertile commodities, is in itself inherently sterile, since it does not naturally multiply when kept in storage by its owner. Furthermore, money is sterile because it does not ensure or enhance the flourishing of the human person apart from the things it can buy. For one cannot feed, clothe oneself, or make tools with money alone. Even misers are only comforted knowing that their money could potentially buy other things, even if they never actually spend it on them. The problem with lending at interest, then, is that it involves increasing money without reference to the commodities from which it derives its value. As Aristotle states, usury makes a gain out of money itself, and not from the natural object of it. Thus, usurers try to make what is naturally sterile into something fertile. According to Aquinas, commodities can be divided into two classes, which must each be marketed according to different standards to satisfy commutative justice. On one hand, the use of some commodities does not involve their consumption. For example, renting a house does not destroy the structure. Since the thing still exists to be returned afterwards, it is just for the owner to charge the renter a fee for the thing's use. This is because the renter is only paying for a right to the use of the thing, and not for ownership of the thing itself. On the other hand, the use of other commodities does involve their consumption. For example, drinking wine and eating bread destroys the very essence of these foodstuffs. Since the thing no longer exists to be returned afterwards, it would be unjust for the seller to charge the buyer a fee for the thing's use. This is because the buyer has already paid to receive ownership of the entire thing, which includes its use. If the seller demanded an additional recompense from the buyer for the use of such a thing, separate from the purchase price of the whole, he would be selling the same thing twice, or double charging him, since the use of such commodities is identical with their consumption. Lending money falls into this second class. For one does not borrow money, use it, and then return it without consuming it. Rather, one spends the money in other things, which entails its loss. From this, it follows that ownership of the money must be transferred from the lender to the borrower, and not merely a right to its use. So, while the lender is entitled to recompense for the original amount lent, it is unfair for him to collect interest above the principal of the loan, since this would entail exacting an extra charge for the use of the money. As Aquinas writes, "It is by its very nature unlawful to take payment for the use of money lent." As a result, usury is a natural offense against human justice, since it fails to give others what they are due and leads to inequality by exploiting them. In this way, usurers subvert the order of civil society, fomenting resentment and anger against them. And because man is created in the image of God, usury is also a supernatural offense against divine justice. For this reason, the usurers in the Inferno suffer eternal wrath, both of nature, symbolized by burning sand, and God, symbolized by fiery snow. Hence, we see that usurers injure the natural human community in the secular state by violating the cardinal virtue of justice, which regulates equitable relations among men. Even worse, however, they also injure the supernatural divine community in the Christian state by violating the theological virtue of charity, which exhorts all men to love their neighbor as themselves for the sake of God. For instead of freely giving their surplus wealth to help others, usurers cruelly exploit the poor by seeking to gain from the want of their fellow man. They take advantage of individuals who are pressured by necessity to borrow money by first offering to assist them with loans, but then crushing them under high interest rates. As Aquinas writes, "Those who pay interest on loans suffer injustice from lenders. Although not compelling borrowers absolutely, lenders nonetheless compel borrowers in a partially voluntary way, namely, in that the lender imposes a heavy burden on one in need of a loan, that the borrower pay back more than the lender lends. And by extorting even more money from the poor, usurers further increase inequality, thereby undermining the integrity of society at large. This is because the human community is not an artificial aggregate of atomized individuals, but a natural unity that transcends each particular part. It is truly one organic social body, which, though composed of many distinct members with their own functions, all work together for the common good to produce an overall harmony in a complementary hierarchy bound together by relations of charity. The problem with usury is that certain parts attempt to benefit themselves at the expense of others, which ends up hurting the whole organism. To expand on the corporeal analogy, it would be as if a man's mouth tried to feed itself by eating his own hands or feet, Likewise, usurers damage the bond of charity between the various classes in civilization by preying upon their fellow citizens. Dante includes several details in the Inferno that emphasize the antisocial aspects of usury. First is the connection between usury and avarice. For usury is connected to a deficiency of liberality and an excess of acquisitiveness that is rooted in the immoderate love for money characterizing avarice. Like the avaricious in upper hell, then, the usurers are depicted as physically unrecognizable. This anonymity shows how their sin has cut them off from society. Since they did not participate constructively in the community by assisting their fellow man in need, but instead destroyed the fabric of civilization by devouring him, the usurers have lost the individuality necessary to be identified by others. Furthermore, their obsessive focus on their money bags reveals an egocentric and self-absorbed attitude. The usurers fail to heed the social obligation to apply their surplus wealth for the benefit of others, instead seeking to expand it beyond their needs without concern for the impact their unscrupulous actions will have on the rest of the community. Moreover, the physical position of the usurers at the edge of the cliff leading down from the seventh circle of the violent into the eighth circle of the malicious and fraudulent demonstrates that their sin is also linked with these two offenses against the charity that should guide all human interactions. Even though usury does not involve formal deception, it still transgresses this love by manipulating others into dealings detrimental to their welfare. Usury also engenders a certain ontological dishonesty by distorting the true nature of the human person as ordered to profiting by productive work. Finally, since the usurer profits from the labor of others without doing any work of his own that would justify him seeking more back from the borrower than he gave him, his sin can also be seen as an act of theft, which robs his fellow man of his rightful possessions, destroying his substance by draining away his hard-earned wages. To sum up, usury turns enterprise away from its natural end and twists the sterile medium of money into an unnatural parody of fertility. By rejecting the divinely ordained order of labor and profit, usurers bring upon themselves the wrath of both God and nature. Above all, these sinners transgress the ties of charity by ravaging the social body of Christendom with their selfish greed. Unfortunately, the modern world has forgotten or chooses to ignore the dangers of usury. Contemporary author John Horvath notes that the massive expansion of credit turns money from a means of purchasing commodities to a middle term that terminates in the end of making more money, throwing the economy out of balance. Horvath observes that leveraging capital in this way produces a system that thrives on easy credit and the issuing of debt. This facilitates risk and the throwing off of restraint. Money becomes a tool of frenetic intemperance. This threat of economic instability explains why pre-modern thinkers opposed taking interest on loans so strongly. From the ancient Romans who compared the ravages of usury on their society to murder, to medieval Christians who denounced it as a scourge which breaks and consumes the poor, and even some more recent figures like the American founding father John Adams, who hoped that someone could find a way to abolish credit. Despite this historic hostility to usury, however, during the 20th century, resistance to the practice weakened, along with the proliferation of the consumer credit schemes which now dominate our economy. But this credit explosion has not been beneficial for civilization. The modern economy has been drained by billion and trillion-dollar losses from the bubbles, busts, and bankruptcies that result from the speculation and profiteering brought by credit. And consumers tempted to live beyond their means by ready access to credit are buried under mountains of debt and mortgages. This crisis could have been avoided had we heeded the wisdom of the Church's ban on usury, which has never been revoked. For contrary to the widespread belief today that medieval restrictions on lending at interest suppressed the economy, they actually stimulated its growth by offering greater security for borrowers, which encouraged larger numbers of risk-sharing investments. As things currently stand, though, how do we restore order in the human community? Horvat proposes that we must start by replacing the iron rule of money with the sweet yoke of justice and charity. Justice ensures a prudent and temperate economy where lenders do not offer credit to those who cannot pay, who are in turn protected from spending what they do not really have and falling into ruin. Finally, charity establishes a civilization where the greater good is valued above lesser goods, and every individual treats his fellow citizen as a brother and not an object for gain. One practical way these virtues of justice and charity might be applied in daily life is for wealthy individuals to offer interest-free loans to less fortunate family members or neighbors.